on Classic Country, AM 1450 again here on this Friday morning. It is now time to take a look at the recent week in review from a news standpoint with Chris Graham of the Augusta Free Press. And Chris, state lawmakers returned to Richmond all this week on Wednesday for a veto session, reconvene session on Wednesday, and the rest of the week was spent trying to redraw district lines. I understand the lawmakers are set to go back, of course, early next week on Monday as they try to finalize these House and Senate district lines as well as these congressional district lines.
Yeah, and some controversy ensuing, as I guess you would expect, because the state Senate is controlled by Democrats and the House is controlled by Republicans, and you're hearing Democrats say that the House plan adopted by Republicans is unfair, and you're hearing Republicans say that the Senate plan adopted by Democrats is unfair. And
because Republicans, had such a great, successful election last November when it comes to strictly the U.S. House of Representatives. I know that was the theory yesterday raised by this plan that deals strictly with congressional district lines, that these are lines that naturally favor the incumbents.
Yeah, well, and that's the case usually no matter what state you're even talking about. When you see the census numbers come out, and it's a political process, so those in power get to redraw the lines. It's interesting though. This is the first time, maybe in Virginia history, but certainly in our recent memory, going back 30, 40, 50 years, where we've had split power in Virginia, with both parties thus having a say in this. Usually it's either Democrats have all the power or Republicans have all the power, and it makes it an easy process because then they can just gerrymander it the way they want to. And we saw in 2000 where going into the 2000 election cycles, the 1999, 2000, 2001 election cycles, it was very close. Representation in the House was, there was that historic power sharing that was going on in the late part of the 1990s between Democrats and Republicans, and then all of a sudden it goes from maybe a 50 to 46 with a couple of independent kind of majority to about a 65-35 split, and that's a big result of gerrymandering. So that as you look at this process, then both parties having a say as far as the final plan that goes through will make it so that I think in the end result it'll be more even. I mean, maybe the House seats will favor the Republican incumbents more, maybe the Senate seats will favor Democrats more, but in the end I think it'll be a wash. And that said, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be that pushing and tugging and the public posturing to try to get things to go more either the way of Democrats or Republicans until they get a final plan approved.
Now, I guess they still have to get this approved by the Justice Department. It's surprising. I mean, this dates back, I guess, to the 60s, where Virginia was one of a number of southern states where we had, racial discrimination, and that impacted voting districts. And it's kind of surprising, almost 50 years later, that they still have to be one of the states in the United States that has to have all this reviewed and approved by the Justice Department.
Well, I know that's one issue raised by some Democrats related to the redistricting, that the drawing of districts doesn't still match up to the population in the state, and then maybe it's something like only half of the districts that are being considered right now by the General Assembly would be majority minority districts, if that makes sense, and so which would have an impact on representation, you'd have to assume, in the General Assembly. So it is an issue still, and we're it's one of our legacies, I guess, as being a southern state, and yeah, that you're right, that does still have to go through that approval. I don't sense anything from looking at the plans just cursorily that would look like that the Justice Department wouldn't give approval to this. So whatever politically is decided, I think for the most part is going to be approved. It's just a rubber stamp approval, but that is another step in the process and could be a factor. Though I don't think it'll be much of a factor, but it could be a factor down the line.
News-wise, the other big news this week, Tim Kaine made it official earlier this week, I think by video, announcing that he is indeed going to run for the Senate seat that's going to be vacated by Jim Webb.
Yes, and that's not surprising, but it's just the timing, and we all knew that, at least a lot of us had thought that the timing was the only question as far as Tim Kaine's running, so now we probably have our heavyweight matchup. George Allen, of course, announced several months ago that he'll be in the running for this seat, and Jim Webb then saying he was not going to run for re-election after serving his term out, his one term out. He'll finish that up and then move on to the sunset.
Let's see, Tim Kaine right now has no opposition for the Democratic nomination on the GOP side. For the Republicans, George Allen actually is facing some opposition, a Tea Party candidate, and there's even talk about maybe a few others trying to get that nomination.
Yeah, and I would be surprised if there wasn't more competition on the GOP side, and I would also be surprised if George Allen doesn't win the nomination pretty handily. But that said, he will have a fight for that nomination. Jamie Radke, the former Tea Party leader here in Virginia, and I say former only in the sense that Jamie has only stepped down to begin running for the Senate. I still think that Radke is still very prominent and looked at very favorably by the Tea Party here in Virginia. But so there's that. Maybe Bob Marshall, the state delegate from Northern Virginia, who has kept his name in the news in various and sundry ways in the last few months, and maybe a couple other challengers as well. But all the polls I'm seeing right now at this very early stage in the process seem to indicate that George Allen will be the overwhelming favorite of Republican voters. But that's before any campaigning's really been done. Jamie Radke, not a known entity statewide. Despite the fact that with leadership in the Tea Party movement, and then of course Bob Marshall probably is pretty well known and probably has high negatives, high positives among the Republican base. So as they campaign, that could get closer, but I still think George Allen will emerge out of that pack, and then a George Allen Tim Kaine race. Talk about a battle of political heavyweights for a Senate seat.
What do you see that race focusing on as far as issues? What issues might decide that Allen Kaine battle? I mean, will it be the records, individual records as governor? Will it be? I know Tim Kaine tried to say earlier this week when he made his announcement that he doesn't toe the party line. He is not that closely connected to Barack Obama and the DNC, even though he was the chair of the DNC. What's really going to decide this race, you think?
Well, I think for the vast majority of voters who only pay attention to elections, within the few weeks leading up to November, we're still 18 months out from that point. There will be lots of posturing by both sides, and we've already seen it. When Tim Kaine announced this week that the Allen campaign put out a statement the day of the announcement from Tim Kaine, attacking his record as governor, and then the Kaine campaign responded back with attacks on Allen's record as governor and then as a U.S. Senator and his role in votes on the wars and the budget deficits that were part and parcel to the Republican administration of George Bush and the Republican Congress of the early part of the 2000s decade. So we've already seen that posturing, but I think for most voters, it's going to come down to the current events issues. Where do these two candidates stand on current issues that are facing the country? And of course, we can say right now what those current issues would be, and we can probably predict what they'll be in 2012. But it is 18 months off, and really October 2012 is going to be the key time as far as our appearance of that, in our views of what the important issues will be. But we can still imagine there'll be the economy. We can imagine it might be some foreign policy issues, and certainly you can't divorce, even though these two guys, Tim Kaine and George Allen, are brand names in Virginia politics. You can't divorce their race from the fact that it's also being contested in a environment with the presidential campaign going on in Virginia. And we know that Barack Obama and his campaign team put a high emphasis on Virginia in 2008, and they were the first Democrats to win in Virginia, going back 44 years. And we know that the Obama campaign is putting a high priority on Virginia in 2012, and in the early polls seem to suggest that Barack Obama would stand to win Virginia again in 2012, even though, of course, Virginia's gone Republican in the last couple of election cycles, but the early polls seem to indicate that Obama would do well in Virginia in 2012, and so you have to consider that that could be a factor leading into 2012 for this race as well. Now, what kind of an impact it could have, who knows? Virginia does have that history of being bipartisan, so maybe they vote for a Democrat for president and vote for a Republican for the Senate. Who knows? But all those factors will be really important as we head into 2012, and we can't really predict which one's going to be the most important at this point.
My question really is not just for this election, but for the bigger picture, as you mentioned, for 2012, the presidential. You would think then the Tea Party folks would they want Republicans to act a certain way, as we saw with that demonstration, I think, earlier this week of a few Tea Party folks demonstrating in front of Bob Goodlane's office in Augusta County. But the theory is, between Republicans and Democrats, they're going to support Republicans over Democrats. Not sure about that. It makes you wonder, I guess. The Tea Party candidates, the Tea Party folks, they've got their ideas in mind of what they like and what they dislike, and they seem to be critical these days of both Democrats and Republicans.
Well, there's that, and also you have to think about the independent voters. The independent voters are going to be leery, I think, of moves too far to the right or too far to the left. That's just generally the way things go. And so the Tea Party movement is really pushing the the Republican Party, excuse me, far to the right on some issues. I mean, we're seeing right now this federal budget impasse is being held up now because of funding for Planned Parenthood. That's just a shocking thing that we might shut the government down because of the Tea Party wanting to get back at Planned Parenthood and play the abortion issue as a key issue. So that might work well on the far right of the Republican base, but how will that play with the independent voters who seem to swing things back and forth? And that's where we've seen the pendulum swinging for really the last 30 years or so in American politics. And in Virginia, there's a sizable base of independent voters as well. And, we see, for example, a candidate like Mark Warner in 2008, and, of course, in his run for governor in 2001, a guy like that who's a Democrat but has an appeal to people on the other side of the aisle. Those kind of candidates run well in Virginia. Now, the question would be for George Allen, for example. Does George Allen, when he's running against Jamie Radke and Bob Marshall, who are far to the right of him on most issues, does he end up having to run to the right to combat them to win the primary and then runs and risk running so far to the right that it's hard for him to come back to the middle in the general election? And I think that's going to be the case for Republicans at the national level as well. The Tea Party certainly has will have a big influence over that presidential primary process over the next, say, year and a half. But what happens then when we get to August and September of 2012? Are those candidates who emerge from that process as the nominees for president and vice president, are they hamstrung by what they had to do to get that nomination to be able to win in November of 2012? And I think a lot of the analysts right now, and I'm probably among them, are thinking that despite the fact that, the economy is not as good as it could be for a president running for re-election, and there's certainly a lot of discord on the international stage right now, that Republicans may end up, knifing each other so much as they go through this primary process that they might hurt themselves in their chances in November of 2012.
Okay, Chris, by the way, are you surprised about the way things have transpired in Washington when it comes to the budget and the possible government shutdown? Does that just leave a lot of people with a bad taste in their mouth about the way things are going these days in Washington?
Well, the history is interesting because if you look back, the last time we had one of these issues, the budget impasse and a budget shutdown, or a government shutdown, was in 1995, and the circumstances were so similar to what we're seeing right now. We had a Democratic president at that time, Bill Clinton, who had lost the midterm elections in 1994, and then Republicans emboldened under Newt Gingrich at that time, the new House Speaker. They were emboldened to stare down Clinton, and they were going to use this to ride in 1996 and win that election. They shut down the government. And if you remember what happened then, the public turned on the Republicans for shutting down the government for what seemed to be really trite personal reasons. And I'm sensing already, you see things, just reading tea leaves, Glenn Beck's show getting canceled on Fox News. I mean, things are already starting to turn in an interesting way right now, it seems to me, politically on a national scale. And if I were advising Republicans right now, I'd say, you know what, go ahead and compromise on this one. Maybe fight the battle next year on the budget on some key issues, but don't let Planned Parenthood funding hold up the entire federal government, because that's not going to play well. It didn't play well in 1995 for Republicans, and I don't think it's going to play well in 2011 for Republicans. So I think in the end, people really just want to see business get done, and I don't know that it's to either side's advantage to see this happen and what we think is going to happen at midnight tonight with a government shutdown. But I really don't think it plays to the advantage of Republicans just because of history. They were the ones who lost as a result of this last time, and I don't think they're going to do too well this time with it either.
Chris, what do we look for in the coming days news-wise from the Augusta Free Press?
Well, we're going to look at some local budget situations, and we'll keep up with of course, the redistricting is a big issue right now. Got to get those districts set so we can have elections here in Virginia in November of 2011. So we'll be following that issue and some other wrapping up state business issues as well.
Okay, Chris Graham with the Augusta Free Press Weekend Review from a news standpoint. We'll come back for more of Online here on Classic Country, AM 1450, right after this.